The nursery was a room of soft blues and golden sunlight, a sanctuary Annie Wilkes had spent months curating for the child growing beneath her heart. But as she stood in the center of that peaceful room, the silence was broken not by a whisper, but by the jagged sound of a secret being ripped from its hiding place. Pregnant wife discovers her husband's secret, and quietly turns the tables. This is a story about the fragility of trust, the sharpening of a woman's resolve, and the chilling realization that the person sleeping beside you might be the architect of your own destruction. Hello, my wonderful friends. I'm so happy you're here with me today. Whether you're curling up with a cup of tea in the quiet of your home or listening on the go, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. How is your day treating you so far? If you enjoy stories of resilience, unexpected twists, and the quiet power of a woman pushed to her limits, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories coming, and I'd love to have you as part of our community. Annie Wilkes lived in a house that looked like a magazine spread, all clean lines, glass walls, and controlled elegance. Her husband, Patrick Bateman, was a man who moved through the world like a shark in a tailored suit. He was powerful, charismatic, and entirely consumed by his career in high-stakes finance. To the outside world, he was the picture of a devoted husband, anxiously awaiting the arrival of their firstborn. To Annie, he was her anchor, or so she had believed until today. It started with a misplaced key. A simple, heavy brass key that had fallen from Patrick's briefcase during his rush to leave for a midnight flight. Curiosity, a feeling Annie usually suppressed in their perfect marriage, nudged her to investigate the small, locked mahogany chest hidden deep in the back of his home office closet. Inside, she didn't find the love letters or the business documents she expected. She found a ledger written in a code of numbers and dates, detailing offshore accounts, shell corporations, and transactions that involved names she recognized from the morning news, names of men who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Beneath the ledger lay a burner phone, its screen flickering as she touched it. A single message sat unread: "The transfer is complete. The liability in the valley will be taken care of by the 20th. The 20th. That was 3 days before her due date. Annie felt the baby kick, a sharp, sudden movement that grounded her. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the book. She didn't rush to call him in a panic. Instead, she stood in the dark office, the air suddenly feeling thin and metallic. She realized then that her marriage was a carefully constructed stage play, and she was merely a prop he had kept around for appearances. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a fixer for the most dangerous people in the city, and she was the next liability on his schedule. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the bookshelf, her face pale, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. The girl who had trusted him was dead. In her place, a woman was born. A woman who realized that if she confronted him now, she would be gone before the sun set. If she wanted to survive, she couldn't be a wife anymore. She had to become the most dangerous player in his game. She slipped the key back into her pocket, hid the ledger exactly where she found it, and smoothed her hair. As she heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, she felt a cold, crystalline clarity. She was going to play the role of the devoted, oblivious wife to perfection. She would watch. She would learn. And by the time he realized she knew the truth, he would be the one trapped in a cage of his own making. How far would you go to protect your future if you realized your life was a lie? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I truly love seeing your take on these high-stakes turnarounds. And if you haven't yet, please do hit that subscribe button. We are just getting started on this journey of redemption and power. The silence in the kitchen that night was heavy, vibrating with the secret Annie Wilkes now carried like a live wire against her skin. Patrick Bateman walked in, his suit jacket draped over his arm, his smile, that practiced, perfectly symmetrical smile, flashing as he leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Late night, darling?" Annie asked, her voice steady, the inflection of a doting wife perfectly calibrated. She placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of a heart that felt absolutely no remorse for the lives he traded in. "The merger, Annie. You know how it is," Patrick replied, his eyes scanning her face for any flicker of suspicion. "I'm close to the finish line. When this closes, we're moving to the coast. You, me, and the little one. Everything is going to be perfect. Everything is going to be perfect." That was his mantra. Patrick viewed his life as a luxury vehicle. He was the driver and everyone else, including his wife, was just a passenger whose only job was to stay in their seat. He didn't love Annie, he loved the image she provided, the stable, pregnant wife who anchored him to a world of respectability. His deepest desire was absolute control, and his greatest fear was the chaos he spent his life manufacturing for others. He didn't suspect her for a second because in his cold, narrow world, Annie wasn't a thinking, feeling creature, she was an asset. Supporting their ideal facade was Dr. Hannibal Lecter, their high society family physician and a man who possessed an unsettlingly sharp eye for detail. He was often at their dinner parties, observing the tension with a feline grace that made Annie's skin crawl. He knew Patrick's darker appetites and in a way he was the architect of the environment that allowed Patrick to thrive. Annie, however, had depths he hadn't yet plumbed. She was a woman who had spent the last 2 years retreating into herself to survive the loneliness of her marriage. She was a master of observation. She knew that Patrick's left eye twitched twice when he was lying, and that he checked his burner phone precisely at 11:15 p.m. every night while in the shower. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a student of his darkness. Upstairs in the nursery, Annie sat in the rocking chair, her journals hidden beneath the floorboard under the rug. These weren't diaries, they were tactical logs. She was mapping his schedule, his offshore accounts, and the names he muttered in his sleep. She had already begun to quietly siphon off small, untraceable amounts of money into a private account in her maiden name, a plan she'd set in motion months ago when she first felt the cracks in their foundation. She had been preparing for an exit. Now she was preparing for a takeover. "You're brooding, Annie," Patrick said from the doorway, his silhouette imposing. He crossed the room and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Is it the baby? Is it me?" "Just tired," she lied, her voice soft, vulnerable. "I'm thinking about the future. About how much I want everything to be right for us." "It will be," he promised, his voice dropping into that smooth, predatory register. "I've taken care of everything. You don't have to worry about a thing." That was the key. He thought she was helpless because of the pregnancy, a fragile vessel he could steer. He didn't realize that the pregnancy was the very thing fueling her transformation. She wasn't fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the life of their child. A life that Patrick had essentially sentenced to become a pawn in his future schemes. She watched him through the mirror as he turned to leave, his movements precise and feline. He saw the way he checked his watch. 11:13 p.m. She knew he would go to the gym, then the shower, then the burner phone. "Patrick," she called out, stopping him at the door. "I found a beautiful nursery rhyme book today. I'd love for you to read to the baby tonight. Just 10 minutes. He hesitated, then sighed, a calculated show of patience. "Of course, dear. Anything for you." He sat down, picking up the book, his performance as the doting father flawless. As he read, Annie watched him, not with love, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a general observing an enemy. She was identifying his patterns, mapping the architecture of his life so she could dismantle it piece by piece. She had found a secret and now she was turning the tables. She was the one holding the strings now, and the puppet master had no idea he was already dancing. The turning point occurred on a rainy Tuesday, exactly 1 week before the scheduled merger, that was actually an extraction mission for Patrick Bateman. He was in the study, his voice a low, modulated hum against the backdrop of the storm as he spoke into the burner phone. "The funds are moved," he said, his tone devoid of any human warmth. "The primary asset will be liquidated once the delivery is complete. No traces left behind." Annie Wilkes stood just outside the half-open door, her hand resting on her stomach, her heart beating a steady rhythmic cadence of pure, cold resolve. She held a digital voice recorder, a small, innocuous device she'd hidden behind the books on the shelf, that had captured every syllable. This was the evidence. This was the key that unlocked his digital cage. But as she turned to retreat into the shadows of the hallway, a floorboard groaned beneath her slipper. Patrick stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. Annie felt a jolt of primal fear, but she didn't freeze. She spun, moving with the heavy, calculated grace of a woman who had practiced this moment in the mirror 100 times. By the time Patrick pushed the door open, she was standing in the hall, holding a glass of warm milk, her eyes wide and perfectly clouded with sleepy confusion. "Patrick, I heard you talking," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sell the act. Is everything okay? You sounded intense. Patrick's gaze swept over her, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. He stood there for a heartbeat, his hands still gripping the phone behind his back. For a second, the shark-like intensity in his eyes was so potent it almost buckled her knees. Just a difficult client in the East, he replied, his smile tight, lacking his usual practiced elegance. Go back to bed, Annie. You shouldn't be wandering in your condition. He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers, the scent of his cologne, expensive, sterile like cold rain, filling her lungs. She watched him walk away, her hands steady, her mind already 3 steps ahead. She went to the nursery, but she didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair, the recorder clutched in her hand, and realized the window of opportunity was closing. He had tightened his grip. He was planning to finalize his exit, and he wouldn't leave her behind to testify or to complicate his new life. She was the liability he mentioned, and the 20th was only days away. She opened her hidden journal and pulled out a map of the city's financial district. She had been tracking his accounts, and tonight she saw the shift. A massive transfer had just cleared into a bank in the Cayman Islands. A sum so large it would be impossible for him to reclaim it without leaving a digital footprint that would alert the authorities. He made her move. Using the access codes she had painstakingly lifted from his laptop, codes he thought were secure behind layers of encryption, she didn't just drain the account. She rerouted the entire sum into a blind trust fund registered in the name of their unborn child, an entity he had no legal right to touch without her signature. Then she sent a single anonymous email to his primary business partner, a man named Gordy Lachance, a man who had long suspected Patrick of skimming off the top. She included a snippet of the audio, the part where Patrick admitted to liquidating the primary asset. She was cutting his lifeline, burning his bridges, and framing the fire as his own tactical error. As she hit send, the glow of the laptop screen illuminated her face. She looked at her reflection, not as a victim but as a predator. Patrick Bateman thought he was playing a game of chess where she was the pawn. He didn't realize she was the one who had cleared the board, rearranged the pieces, and set the trap. He walked into the bedroom, his eyes dark, his mind clearly on the mess he was about to make. He didn't know that his entire life's work, the wealth, the power, the safety, had just evaporated into a digital abyss created by the woman he thought was too fragile to understand his business. "Everything all right, darling?" she asked, pulling the covers up as he approached the bed. "Everything is under control," he whispered, kissing her forehead. She smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that he mistook for devotion. "I know, Patrick. I know exactly how things are going to end." The following 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Annie Wilkes moved through their home like a ghost, her movements fluid and utterly devoid of the frantic energy Patrick expected. Patrick Bateman was beginning to unravel, though he masked it behind layers of manic productivity. His business partner, Gordy Lachance, had started calling the house at all hours, his voice echoing with a cold, threatening undertone that Patrick tried to dismiss as work-related friction. The digital noose was tightening. Annie watched from the periphery as Patrick's perfect financial empire began to show microscopic cracks. He grew irritable, his movements losing their predatory precision. He began to check his devices incessantly, his eyes darting toward the study every time Annie walked past. He suspected something was wrong, but his ego, his absolute blinding certainty that Annie was a mere accessory, prevented him from identifying her as the architect of his ruin. The real tension, however, blossomed in the quiet spaces between their interactions. At dinner, Patrick would watch her, his fork clinking against the fine china, a question burning in his eyes. Annie would simply smile, a soft, nurturing expression that made his skin crawl. "You're very quiet lately, Annie," he said, his voice dropping into that familiar, menacing smooth register. "Is the pregnancy taking its toll? You seem distracted." "Just nesting, Patrick," she replied, buttering a slice of sourdough. "Thinking about how much is going to change once the baby arrives. How much everything is going to change." Her double entendre hit its mark. Patrick's jaw tightened. He stood up, pacing the length of the dining room. "Change is inevitable. But I control the narrative of our lives. Don't ever forget that, Annie. You're here because I allow it. Everything you have, everything you are, is a gift from me." Annie felt a cold thrill of victory. He was trying to re-establish dominance, to cow her back into the role of the submissive wife. But she saw through the bravado. He was terrified. He had received a notification from his bank earlier that afternoon. A cryptic, system-generated message stating that his primary liquidity had been reassigned to a custodial account for the benefit of a minor. He didn't know the minor was his own child. He thought it was a legal glitch, a mistake in his offshore layering. He was currently burning through his connections, demanding answers from his associates, completely unaware that his wife was the one holding the digital key to his entire future. The tension reached a breaking point on the night of the 19th. A thunderstorm was rattling the glass walls of the house, and the power flickered, plunging them into sudden, suffocating darkness. Patrick panicked. He rushed to his office, his boots thundering on the hardwood, and Annie followed, her pulse steady as a drum. She stood in the doorway as he frantically fumbled with his laptop, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen. He was screaming into the phone, his voice ragged, a far cry from the cool corporate shark he usually projected. "Fix it. I don't care how much it costs, I want that account unlocked. Who has the master key?" Annie walked into the room, leaning against the doorframe, her arms folded over her belly. "Maybe you should try a different password, Patrick. Something that means more to you than just greed." He spun around, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the facade finally shattering completely. "What did you say?" "I said the account is gone," she whispered, her voice like a cold wind. "And the information you've been hiding? It's not just in your ledger anymore. It's with the people you've been skimming from for years. Gordy is on his way, Patrick. And he doesn't sound like he wants to discuss the merger." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the sound of the rain and the realization that his entire world, his safety, his wealth, his control, had been systematically dismantled by the woman he had spent years trying to ignore. He lunged toward her, his face a mask of primal, unhinged rage, but Annie didn't flinch. She just tapped the small device in her pocket, the one connected to a local law enforcement frequency she had intercepted. "They're 3 minutes away, Patrick," she said, her voice devoid of fear. "And they're not looking for a business partner. They're looking for the man who liquidated the asset." The study felt like a pressure cooker, the air ionized by the storm outside and the absolute, suffocating terror radiating from Patrick Bateman. He stood frozen, his hand hovering over the desk, his eyes darting to the door as he heard the distant rhythmic wail of sirens cutting through the thunder. The shark had finally realized he was swimming in a tank that had been drained. "You," Patrick whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at Annie Wilkes as if seeing a stranger. "You were never that girl. The one who wanted the nursery, the one who cooked the dinners. It was all a mask." Annie didn't move. She stood with her chin lifted, a cool, terrifying composure radiating from her. "The nursery was for our child, Patrick. The dinners were for the life I wanted to believe in. But you weren't my husband. You were a parasite that moved into my life to feed on its legitimacy. You never saw me. If you had, you would have known I was the only person in this city capable of outplaying you." Patrick sneered, a desperate, pathetic sound. "You think the police will save you? They're in my pocket. Every judge, every captain, they all answer to the firm. You haven't ruined me, Annie. You've just made yourself a target." He reached for the heavy brass letter opener on his desk, his fingers curling around the cold metal. But before he could take a single step, the study door kicked open. It wasn't the police. It was Gordy Lachance, his face a map of cold, calculated fury, flanked by 2 men who didn't look like financiers. They looked like shadows. "Drop the blade, Patrick," Gordy said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He held up a tablet displaying the exact same screen Annie had been watching. The trail of the drained accounts and the damning audio recordings. "The firm has decided that your merger is now a liquidation of a different sort." Patrick's face drained of color. He looked from Gordy to Annie, his mind racing, trying to find a tactical advantage that no longer existed. "She set it up. She manipulated the transfers. She's the one who stole from you." Annie stepped forward, her hand resting on her stomach. She looked at Gordy with an expression of pure, heartbreaking innocence, the same performance she had used for years. "I'm just a pregnant wife, Gordy. Patrick has been using our joint accounts for his private business for years. I only found out when the bank called me this morning about the irregular activities. I tried to tell him to stop, but he threatened me." She looked at Patrick, her eyes filling with convincing, crystalline tears. He told me if I ever spoke up I wouldn't live to see the baby born. The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the room. Gordy looked at Patrick, not as a partner, but as a liability who had brought a chaotic, complaining wife into their inner circle. Patrick realized then that the trap wasn't just digital, it was social. Annie hadn't just stolen his money, she had weaponized his own misogyny against him. He had spent years dismissing her as a harmless accessory, and that very underestimation was now the shroud covering his coffin. Is that true, Patrick? Gordy stepped closer, his shadow falling over the desk. You were going to let your wife take the fall for your sloppy bookkeeping? She's lying. Patrick shrieked, lunging toward Annie, but Gordy's men were faster. They tackled him, pinning him to the floor with a brutal efficiency that sent a shockwave through the room. Annie stood over him, her silhouette framed by the lightning flashing behind the glass walls. She didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him with the chilling indifference one reserves for a broken appliance. The real tragedy, Patrick, she whispered, leaning down so only he could hear, is that you actually believed you were the smartest person in the room. You controlled the finances, you controlled the house, and you controlled the secrets. But you never controlled the person who was watching you the whole time. She turned to Gordy, her expression instantly shifting back to that of a concerned, frightened, expectant mother. Please just take him away. I don't care about the money. I just want my child to be safe. Gordy nodded, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. You're a strong woman, Annie. He never deserved you. As they dragged Patrick out into the storm, his muffled screams fading into the distance, Annie walked back to the nursery. The house was finally, blissfully quiet. She had neutralized the threat, secured her future, and orchestrated the downfall of the most powerful man she knew, all while appearing to be the helpless, devoted wife. The midpoint of her journey wasn't just a realization. It was the coronation of a new queen. She sat in the rocking chair, listening to the rain, feeling the baby kick against her palm, a steady, rhythmic confirmation that they were finally, truly free. The house, once a fortress of sterile perfection, now felt like a mausoleum. With Patrick Bateman gone, Annie Wilkes expected the crushing weight of relief. Instead, she found a different kind of terror. The silence that filled the hallways was absolute, and with every shadow that shifted in the moonlight, she felt the phantom presence of the world Patrick had belonged to. She had neutralized the man, but she hadn't neutralized the reach of his employers. The first indication of her mistake came at 3 a.m. She was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when the security system, the state-of-the-art perimeter Patrick had bragged about, suddenly chirped and went dark. Every light in the house died simultaneously. Annie didn't scream. She rolled out of bed, her movements heavy but deliberate, and pulled a hidden emergency bag from beneath the loose floorboard in the nursery. Inside was a burner phone, a stack of cash, and a passport she had manufactured weeks ago. She heard it then, the sound of a key turning in the front door. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic entrance of police. It was the slow, rhythmic click of heavy boots on the marble foyer, the sound of someone who had nothing to fear. Annie. The voice was soft, melodic, and sickeningly familiar. It was Dr. Hannibal Lecter. He wasn't there to arrest her. He was there to audit her. Annie crouched in the dark of the nursery, her hand pressed firmly over her belly. She could hear him moving through the living room, his footsteps light, like a predatory cat. He wasn't rushing, he was savoring the hunt. I must confess, Annie, Hannibal called out, his voice echoing through the open-plan house. Patrick was a vulgar, impulsive creature. He lacked the artistry required for true power. I spent years trying to refine him, but he was always destined for the gutter. However, you are a fascinating discovery. Annie crept toward the back staircase, but a floorboard creaked, a sharp, betraying sound in the stillness. Hannibal stopped. You played a brilliant game of chess, my dear. Truly. But you forgot one thing. The board doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are those of us who observe the players and those of us who set the stakes. She reached the mudroom, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had the car keys in her hand, but as she reached for the handle of the side door, she stopped. The lock had been replaced. She was trapped in her own home. She turned to see Hannibal standing in the archway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the street lamps outside. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a glass of wine, his posture relaxed, his eyes glinting with a terrifying, intellectual curiosity. Patrick was a liability and I am quite content to see him discarded, Hannibal continued, walking toward her with that feline grace. But you have proven yourself to be a significant variable. You have disrupted the flow of my interests. And in my world, variables that cannot be accounted for must be integrated or removed. Annie backed away until she hit the kitchen island. She felt the heavy, sharp-edged chef's knife she had left on the counter earlier that evening, but her hand shook as she reached for it. I didn't want this, she whispered, her voice failing her for the first time. Nobody ever does, Hannibal replied, his voice barely a breath. But you are a mother now. And a mother's greatest weakness is the desire for a future. You have built a beautiful life in your mind, Annie. But tonight, that dream is going to be tested in the most visceral way. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. A remote trigger. I have placed devices throughout this house, Annie. Not explosives, no. That would be too crude. Something much more localized. If you don't step away from that knife and walk with me, I will ensure that the environment you have so carefully curated for your child becomes the very last thing you ever see. Annie looked at the kitchen clock. 3:15 a.m. She was hours away from her due date. The physical agony of a contraction tore through her, a sharp, blinding pain that brought her to her knees. Hannibal watched her with a clinical, detached interest. The biology of your predicament is inconvenient, isn't it? Pain, fear, the biological imperative of the fetus. It's all so messy. Annie curled on the floor, clutching her stomach. The pain was real, but the terror was deeper. She was alone in labor, being hunted by a man who saw her as a scientific curiosity. She had turned the tables on the shark, only to find herself in the ocean with something much older and much hungrier. She looked up at him, her vision blurring with sweat and tears. She had lost the edge, lost the control, and for the first time she truly believed that she and her child were not going to make it out of the house alive. The agony of the contraction receded, leaving Annie Wilkes breathless on the cold kitchen tiles. Dr. Hannibal Lecter stood over her, his eyes cold, clinical, and devoid of empathy. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, expecting the broken resignation of a mother who had lost everything. The biological clock is a cruel master, isn't it, Annie? He murmured, checking his own watch. 3 minutes between spasms. You are remarkably efficient. Annie didn't answer. Her hand moved beneath her loose tunic, not toward the knife on the counter, but toward the inner pocket of her maternity leggings. Her fingers brushed against a small, flat device, a backup remote she had fashioned from the circuitry of the home's smart lighting system. She had anticipated a betrayal. She had just miscalculated the source. She realized then that Hannibal was arrogant. He viewed her as a variable he had already solved. He hadn't accounted for the fact that she had spent weeks studying his medical records, his habits, and the architecture of the house they were both currently standing in. You speak of biology as if it were a weakness, Annie whispered, her voice gaining strength, a sharp metallic edge cutting through her pain. But you're forgetting the primary imperative of a mother, doctor. It's not fear. It's preservation. She triggered the device. The house didn't explode, but the entire smart home grid, the sprinklers, the security shutters, and the high-frequency sonic alarm systems, erupted into a chaotic, synchronized symphony of disruption. The fire suppression system in the kitchen blasted a thick, opaque cloud of white chemical foam, instantly obscuring the room. Hannibal stepped back, his clinical composure momentarily shattered by the sudden, deafening shriek of the high-frequency alarm. A frequency Annie had calculated to disorient, if not incapacitate, a human nervous system. You fool, he hissed, his voice strained as he clutched his temples. Annie didn't stay to fight. She scrambled toward the mudroom, using the emergency flares she had placed in the floorboard weeks ago to light her path through the blinding foam. The pain of the labor was a tidal wave, but she channeled it, every ounce of that raw, primal energy into the singular act of moving toward the exit. She reached the side door. She didn't use the key, she used the override code she had patched into the smart locks firmware. The door clicked open and the cool, humid air of the early morning rushed in, stinging her lungs. She stumbled out into the backyard toward the secondary garage, a space Hannibal hadn't bothered to secure because he believed her to be trapped inside the primary perimeter. She felt the baby move, a powerful kick that felt like a final, urgent push. Not here. Not in the dark. She reached the garage and slid into the driver's seat of the vintage station wagon she had kept tuned and fueled for weeks. As she turned the ignition, the engine roared to life, a sound of defiance in the quiet night. She didn't look back at the house, at the man who thought he had outsmarted her, or at the shattered remnants of her marriage. She looked at the road ahead. She had navigated the shark, she had outmaneuvered the puppet master, and now she was navigating the birth of her own future. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but it no longer signaled defeat. It signaled the beginning. "We're going," she whispered to the child, her voice fierce and steady. "We're going to be okay." As the tires spun on the gravel and she tore onto the main highway, she saw a flicker of movement in the house's window. Hannibal was watching her. He wasn't pursuing. He was standing still, his expression unreadable, a mixture of cold intrigue and respect. He had lost his variable, but for a split second she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. A realization that he had met an intellect that didn't just survive his game but had rewritten it. The highway was a ribbon of black glass beneath the moonlight, but Annie Wilkes knew she couldn't outrun a man like Hannibal Lecter forever. Her body was a battlefield of exertion and agonizing contractions, each one reminding her that her time was running out. She didn't head for the state lines, she headed for the one place he would never expect, the city's central archives. She pulled the station wagon into the underground parking structure of the municipal building. The pain was blinding now, coming in relentless waves that made her vision swim. She grabbed her bag and stumbled toward the elevator, her fingers trembling as she punched in the code she had stolen from the city's digital database months ago. She wasn't running away anymore. She was executing the final phase of her plan. She reached the server room, the cold, humming heart of the city's records. If she could upload the encrypted ledger and the recorded admissions of both Patrick Bateman and Hannibal's influence into the public domain, she would turn the city's entire power structure against them. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about erasing their influence so they could never reach for her or her child again. As the progress bar on the screen crawled toward 100%, she heard the soft, familiar click of a door latch. She didn't turn around. She leaned against the console, clutching the edge of the metal desk. "You are a remarkably resilient specimen, Annie," Hannibal said. He walked into the light, his hands neatly folded in front of him. He wasn't breathing hard. He moved with the same maddeningly composed grace as before. "I must say, I am almost disappointed you chose to spend your final minutes in such a pedestrian location." "It's not my final minutes," Annie panted, her voice strained. "It's yours." "Is it?" Hannibal stepped closer, his gaze drifting to the screen. "You think you can upload the truth to a world that doesn't want to hear it? You think these files will hold up against the weight of the men who own the servers?" "The servers aren't just public, Hannibal," Annie said, a faint, triumphant smile touching her lips. "They're mirrored to every major news outlet in the country. The upload isn't for the authorities. It's for the court of public opinion. Once it's out, you can't kill enough people to bury it." Hannibal's eyes flickered just for a second with a hint of genuine shock. He reached for his pocket, likely for the small, sterile blade he carried, but Annie triggered the server's emergency fire suppression mechanism one last time. This time it wasn't foam. It was a high-pressure burst of liquid nitrogen, designed to flash freeze the room's electronics in the event of a critical failure. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly, the air turning into a frozen, swirling mist. Hannibal stumbled, his eyes widening as the cold took hold of his refined, controlled movements. He wasn't a god, he was flesh and blood, and his body began to seize in the sub-zero environment. Annie grabbed the final drive, her breath frosting in the air. She didn't look at him as she slumped to the floor, the final, most intense contraction of her life tearing through her. She heard the sound of police sirens, dozens of them, screaming into the underground garage. The upload had worked. The city was finally listening. As the heavy steel doors of the server room were battered open by tactical units responding to the massive security breach, Hannibal disappeared into the vents, his defeat not a physical death, but the total annihilation of his carefully constructed influence. He was no longer the unseen architect. He was a ghost, chased into the shadows by the light Annie had brought to the surface. She felt a hand on her shoulder, but it wasn't the cold touch of a predator. It was a paramedic, his face etched with concern. "Ma'am, you're in labor. We have you, you're safe." Annie closed her eyes, the weight of the last few days finally crushing her. She heard the chaotic, beautiful sounds of a world waking up to the truth. The chatter of reporters, the shouting of police, the sudden end of a nightmare. She looked down at her stomach, then up at the paramedic. "I'm ready," she whispered. She had faced the shark and the butcher and she had won. Her daughter would be born into a world where the monsters had been exposed, their masks stripped away. The game was over, and for the first time she was the one who had written the final chapter. The sterile white walls of the recovery room were bathed in the soft, honeyed glow of the morning sun. For Annie Wilkes, the world felt transformed, no longer a collection of jagged edges and hidden traps, but a landscape of possibility. The relentless hum of the city outside was no longer a threat. It was the sound of a society finally waking up, grappling with the explosive, world-shifting truth she had unleashed. The documents she had uploaded had done more than just destroy Patrick Bateman and expose the shadow network of Dr. Hannibal Lecter. They had started a fire. Across the city, arrests were being made, boardrooms were being raided, and the toxic architecture of the life she had once thought was perfect was being dismantled brick by brick. Beside her, in a clear plastic bassinet, lay her daughter. She was tiny, fierce, and utterly perfect. A life that was never meant to be a pawn in a game of power. Annie watched the rhythmic rise and fall of the baby's chest, a steady, grounding anchor in the wake of the storm. A nurse knocked softly, bringing in a small bouquet of wildflowers. "These were left at the desk for you, Ms. Wilkes. There's no card, but the florist said they were ordered before everything happened." Annie took the flowers, their scent of clover and damp earth reminding her of the small, hidden dreams she had once tucked away. She knew who they were from. It wasn't an apology, it was an acknowledgement. A nod from the ghost in the vents, recognizing that for the first time in his long, dark career, he had been checkmated not by a fellow monster but by a mother. She didn't let the thought linger. Those people were chapters that had been closed, sealed, and archived. Her brother-in-law, Gordy Lachance, had become an unlikely ally in the aftermath. He entered the room quietly, his expression one of somber respect. He placed a thick envelope on the bedside table, the legal transfer of the blind trust she had secured for her daughter, now fully validated and protected by the highest courts in the state. "You're a hard person to find, Annie," Gordy said, his voice quiet. "The city thinks you're a hero. The press is calling you the architect of truth. They want to know everything." "I don't want to be a hero, Gordy," Annie replied, her gaze fixed on her daughter. "I just want to be a mother. I want to raise her in a world where she doesn't have to watch or listen, or turn tables just to survive." "You did that for her," he said. "You wiped the board clean." As he left, Annie picked up her daughter, feeling the weight of her, a tiny, warm reality against her own skin. She walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline. The skyscrapers were still there, gleaming in the sun, but the power dynamics had shifted. The Shadow Kings had been toppled, and the silence that followed was no longer the suffocating quiet of a secret. It was the peaceful silence of a new beginning. She realized then that her strength hadn't come from the tactical logs or the burner phones. It had come from the quiet, unyielding love she held for the life she had fought to protect. She was no longer the wife of a shark. She was simply Annie, and for the first time in her life she was completely, terrifyingly, wonderfully free. She began to hum a quiet, simple melody, a song her own mother had taught her, and as the baby drifted into a peaceful sleep, Annie looked at her reflection in the window. She saw a woman who had been pushed into the fire and had emerged not as ash but as steel. She turned away from the glass, away from the past and toward the future. The game was over, the tables were turned, and she was finally ready to start the life she had always deserved. Thank you for walking this path with me. Watching Annie evolve from a woman trapped in a lie to the architect of her own liberation has been an incredible journey. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how tightly the strings are pulled, our own agency is the one thing no one can truly take away from us. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Annie's transformation. Did you have a favorite moment where she finally took the power back from Patrick? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you've enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so we can continue to explore these epic journeys together. Until next time, stay strong, stay vigilant, and remember, you are the author of your own story.